Someone else asks, just, the sheer scope of your beat. So how do you manage covering such a wide range of countries? What does your workflow look like in order to achieve that breadth without giving up the depth? Great question.
That is a great question. So I will speak pre-pandemic because we've mostly focused on Mexico and Ecuador and Peru because those have been the worst affected. But we...
And can you just back up, what is your beat? What's the scope of it?
So it's Latin America and the Caribbean.
And how many countries altogether are we talking? Like dozens?
Although I haven't made it out to the Caribbean yet because there's fires to put out on the continent.
Wow.
Stories that, so we know we're not going to get everything, and we always do give up depth because we give up stories that would be great to tell, but we just don't have the manpower. So we it's two things. We either go for stories that are really significant and they talk about, they say something about a country widely, and it's something shocking or surprising or horrifying for an American audience, and it's not being reported, so we report it. Or, when something like Bolivia happens, or there's another attempted insurrection in Venezuela, then we go in and try, we still make sure that we're in the news with whatever is, front page at the time, but we try to go for a different aspect. Like the Venezuela story, how can we tell the story of how, we want to tell the story of how no one's winning in Venezuela. I mean, the people that are close to the government, but, the rich people and the poor people, for the most part, everyone is struggling. And this is a system that doesn't work for most people. So how do we tell that story? Well, we tell the story through this woman who had a lot of money, who is now going hungry, and she's bony and her clothes are full of holes, and she was so wealthy. She traveled to Europe every other month, and the workers around her who are just as hungry. So we tell the story because we can't, we're not Reuters, we're not AP, we're not gonna probably break news on like the next insurrection before it happens, but we can tell the story of what's happening through, something completely out of the way.
When it's also, we were talking a little bit before the panel began, it's harder to place international stories in a US publication, or it has been under the Trump administration, frankly, because there was such a focus on the domestic situation still. I mean, was that hard? Was it, can you talk about that, just like kind of the appetite for news from the region the past years?
It was really difficult, and I don't know how it would have gone had I been at another publication. I don't think that mainstream US media would have put, there was a lot of time and a lot of resources invested in this series, and I don't know that it would have been as easy to convince the Times or the Post or whoever to invest in a whole year of this, and that's because I work at BuzzFeed, and there at least before the pandemic, there was this huge interest in covering vulnerable communities everywhere, even during Trump. But we're talking about 1 year of Trump. The other year, and this was the series during this 1 year, but in general under Trump, it's just been so hard. Every story is like, I don't think Americans are going to care. They've got so much on their plate. Like, no, bring me something that's got a Trump angle or a US angle. And it's very recent, but I hope it changes under Biden, but who knows? I mean, the pandemic it's also so US centric because the response has been so botched that I don't know that it's going to change anytime soon. It's very frustrating.
Even listening to you talking about some of the themes that you're covering, polarization, misogynistic attacks on elected women, sort of just deep polarization, party over unity, all of these kinds of themes that we're covering here in the States as well. And so I do think it's a testament to your work that you do have so many fans out there, because you have found, people to put faces on and to humanize these really big issues. What happens next for you on this beat? What are some of the themes for this year that are they any different? Is it kind of, did the administration change here make any difference in the lives of these women you're covering?
So there was a restructuring at BuzzFeed, and I'm now tasked with covering inequality. And so I'm looking at inequality in Latin America and how that intersects with the pandemic.
Can I just, because I don't, if people aren't from BuzzFeed, they might not know. Sometimes at BuzzFeed, there's not the traditional beat structure. You know, that sometimes it's thematic, you know, and so it's not just Latin America, it's inequality. And so it'll be issues throughout the region, right? Which I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about and rethinking beat structures when I went to BuzzFeed. And they didn't cover, you don't cover this building as an agency, you cover the themes. So that's what you're looking at, inequality.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a broad issue that almost anything fits under inequality, and the pandemic has just deepened and made it so much worse. You know, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and the poor are dying in much higher numbers, and the hospitals are a wreck, and you know, private hospitals are just in so much better shape, and you know, I mean, just the issue of women's rights, like, and women's safety, you know, it's that inequality has grown even more because women are facing you know, it's a catch-22 that men aren't facing right now. But you know, they don't want to go outside because there's COVID. They don't want to get sick because then you end up in a horrible hospital with, you know, maybe not a bed available. But if they stay at home, there's domestic violence. Their children are getting beaten up. You know, husbands are drinking more, and so there's even less of a safe space for women right now. And so, if that's not inequality, I don't know what is.
You live in Mexico City, right? And you're traveling throughout the region. A lot of these stories do show women, you know, as victims of state violence, local violence, some sort of, you know, trauma. I'm sure you also have many other experiences, you know, that are joyful and hopeful, and you know that's not the sort of sum total of these women's lives. Is it hard to kind of, I mean, do you look for ways to, I don't know, break out of that prism? Is it hard? It was always a perennial, I don't know, factor in covering even, you know, Middle East here, et cetera, where you feel like these are so important and they must be told, and they get to the heart of human rights and civil liberties. And yet there are just one snapshot, and repeated again and again, it's sort of creates the archetype of the long-suffering, oppressed woman. How do you combat that? How do you deal with that?
Oof, that's a really good question. I don't think I do a good enough job because I'm just covering horrific stories with sad endings most of the time. I tried to cover last year, at the beginning of last year, or I think at the end of 2019, like my favorite spot in Mexico City, it's this basement, or it's like a warehouse, Patrick Miller, and you go dance, and it's just like the healthiest, funnest place ever because it's like circles, and you go in if you're really good, if you've practiced for weeks at home, and it's just like dance-offs, and it's amazing. And I went and I reported it out, and it was great. And I was like, okay, good. You know, Mexico isn't just narcos and women suffering and horrible things, and you know, let's do the story about this magical place where there's no class and there's no social, you know, there's no race, and then the pandemic hit, and I didn't write it. So we got to do better.
That's great. Well, so the impulse is there, and in any way, you're the stories, you know, your stories, the women are three-dimensional in these stories, and you see them as more than victim. They're definitely there, you know, shouting at the border agency, you know, or, you know, advocating for themselves. I think we're almost out of time. I did want to get to one extremely important question from a high-ranking official named Karla Zabludovsky, who asks, do you miss your family when you're on assignment?
Daniela, very much. And part of the reason why—
who is this to ask?
This is my sister.
Okay.
Honestly, it kind of coincided, the thing in Nicaragua, and my nephew, he's 3.5. And he, you know, at that time, like 2.5 years ago, he was still like this peanut with no personality, but now he's got a personality, and he's so funny and he's so loving, and it's so delicious to see him, to spend time with him, that it definitely figures into my, I mean, I can't travel right now, but when we can travel again, I don't want to take risks because I want to hang out with him. And I miss my sister. Yeah, I miss my family. I also don't want them to be like perennially scared when I'm traveling. So, I mean, I don't want to say I'm out. I've had a really good run, but I think like as time goes by, my risk threshold is just going to get shorter and shorter.